Mr Deputy Speaker. Following a number of thwarted attempts, in March 2015, the government called for voluntary nominations of land to establish a national radioactive waste management facility. I raised the issue of the possibility of this being well sited in my hometown, in fact on my own farm, in April 2015. The process came about after the failure of the Muckaty Station proposal, following the failure of an earlier proposal in South Australia, and was recommended by an independent panel, an independent inquiry which include conservationists, people from other sides of politics, that actually recommended that the Australian government should pursue voluntary nomination of private land for the establishment of this facility, and then following that process work out where the most likely site was. So I brought it up in early 2015 in my town. This is a very important thing for the Australian nation. The Opal reactor, and before that the HIFAR reactor at Lucas Heights, provides nuclear medicine for Australians on a daily basis. Around about 12,000 doses a week at the moment. And in fact, the establishment of the Opal reactor was a very forward-thinking move by the Howard government. It met some opposition at the time. But it now not only provides that medication for Australians and assistance to industry and other things, it is also a growing export trade, because some other countries in the world have not had the courage to get along and do the same thing. When Lucas Heights was established, the residents of Lucas Heights were guaranteed that this would be only temporary storage of the low-level waste and that a permanent repository would be found. And the other issue with Lucas Heights is it's running out of room. I've been there, as have many citizens of Kimber. It's interesting that the waste that we're talking about largely sits in 44-gallon drums or 200-litre drums. It is unshielded. The workers do not wear protective clothing, and they can work in that facility for around about 10 years before they get the same equivalent radiation of one CT scan. It's not incredibly dangerous. It's not incredibly difficult to look after, but we need to find a repository. Plus that, there is over 100 sites around Australia and where this sits in a hospital basis. We say over 100 because we don't actually know how many there are. I suspect there's closer to 300 in basements that are unlicensed, not specifically designed for the purpose. So there is an imperative that we get on with the job. So this process was undertaken, and this bill now sits on the Senate notice paper. It's been through the House of Representatives to nominate the Kimber site and get on with the job. I'll come to that a little bit more in a moment. And I've had a delegation in here in the last 2 days trying to make sure that it passes through the Senate. I'd have to thank those people that have made their time available to us, including the Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese, the Shadow Minister responsible in Brendan O'Connor. We've met with a number of independents, and we met with the Prime Minister as well. But I'd have to say I'm really disappointed, particularly in the Labor Party, in that they are clinging to some kind of commitment to the legislation they passed in 2012, which they say is sufficient to establish the radioactive waste management facility. This legislation includes a whole lot of references to Northern Territory, because at that stage they thought it was going to Muckaty Station. It also has references to the payments that go to community, which are now completely out of date and not what has been promised to the successful community. So it needs to be amended. But what they are saying, what the Labor Party is saying, and some of the crossbenchers, it must be said, is that the minister can declare under the current legislation the establishment of the site. But because they are not prepared to allow the site to be named in the legislation, that will allow that to be open to judicial review at every stage. And that means any person, any body, any organisation in Australia can announce that they have an interest and then challenge. I've already made up a list of 10 conservation groups that are on the record as opposing this facility. If we go down this pathway, this process that has been running for now over 5 years will go for another 5 years. And that will extend the process in my hometown of Kimber that has actually gone down this pathway and gone and ticked all the boxes to say we are prepared to host this site. So to come to my hometown and community of Kimber, and I've given a second reading speech on this bill when it came through the House, which stepped out my involvement in this process. But let it be said, it's a community with about 1,050 people. We had a population in the late 80s of close to 2,000, 1,900. It is a continual decline of population that we are seeing across agricultural regions, and it's because of the efficiency of modern agriculture. It's not a bad story, it's a good story, but it is a story that leads to smaller and smaller towns on a continual basis. Once you get to a certain tipping point, then your health services are under threat, your school is under threat. The shops that actually make this a livable place are under threat. Kimber hasn't got to that point yet, but we're not so far away from it. We've seen towns around us basically disappear, and we want to make sure that we need to attract a new industry. So the Kimber community, after this was raised in 2015, has been through a survey. We've been through two full plebiscites to vote on this position. We've had 3 Senate inquiries. It has been ticked off and approved at every level, and yet we still have resistance from the Labor Party to actually allowing this to go ahead. They want to, it seems as though they want to extend the pain. Like, not for 1 minute do I come into this place and say this hasn't been a difficult debate in Kimber, that, you know, people have not found it difficult. Let me say, I can take you to the side of a proposed wind farm and give you the same kind of difficulties, or the proposed side of a new port where people don't want it, or whatever, and it's the same type of thing. But these things happen in communities. But the net result is that we had the last community ballot showed 61.58% of people, and with over 90% turnout, have voted in favour of hosting this facility. Now that's in the same area that the same-sex, the same-sex marriage debate was decided at a national level, and that was a landslide. I can show you any number of clippings that will tell you that was a landslide. So this is a landslide in Kimber. We want the facility, and yet now we are being frustrated. It seems as though we're going to be frustrated. Now, I'm still hopeful that some senators will come round and we'll get this legislation through the Senate this week. But it's really important to note that if we've got some really strong individuals that have nominated their land. They've nominated their land because they want a future for their children in the Kimber community. They want their grandchildren to be able to get jobs in the Kimber community, because our greatest export, after wheat perhaps, or perhaps before wheat, are our children. Because they need the opportunities for employment. They're brought up in a good, great community. They're brought up in a good school, but then they have to leave the community and go and find work elsewhere. Now, this facility brings with it 45 jobs. It brings with it an annual investment for the community of around about $1 million, depending on how we manage it, and it brings $8 million worth of activity into the community per year. It is a lifeline for a community like Kimber. It could have been anywhere in Australia, but this is the one population that's been brave enough to stand up, have the debate, internally and externally. Let me tell you, there are a lot of brave warriors on the keyboards out there giving advice from Sydney, Melbourne, overseas, signing hundreds of names on petitions that don't even live in Australia. Plenty of advice coming from people outside. But from the people in Kimber, how about we respect their decision? They've spent 5.5 years discussing this. We've had every expert available in Australia come and visit. We've had mayors from communities in other nations come and tell us how fabulous these facilities are for their communities. We've had scientists at every level. We've had geologists speak to us, nuclear scientists, medical scientists. It is backed at every level. The nation needs it, and we need to get on with the job. Because if we extend this process for another 4 or 5 years at Kimber, we might lose them. And we can go back 40 years, because Paul Keating proposed this in the first place, and start all over again. And what community would ever put their hand up for this again if this Parliament frustrates their will, having ticked every box, done everything that was required of them and actually got over the line and said, we will do it, then the Parliament says you can't.
I call the member